Hello and welcome to the episode 12 of TE Present Teacher. Yes, episode 12. And that means that we have been doing this for 6 months now, and that makes us happy. I hope you have been liking these videos. And just recently, we also finished 25 episodes of TE Pedagogy Power Ups, our other series of videos. The link is in the show notes. Go look that up, but not right now, a little bit later after this video. In today's video, we are going to be talking about around the topic of assessments. We're going to specifically be talking about questions. What are recall questions? What are application questions? And the misconceptions surrounding these. And for that, we have Ritu here today. Hi, Ritu.
Hi.
So there has been a lot of conversations about, having formative assessments, doing weekly progress reports, and trying to understand how the students are progressing, etc. And that's on one hand. On the other hand, there's also been a lot of push for, get more students to not do rote-based learning. They need to be, understanding the concepts better. They should be able to apply the concepts better. And I think both of these things have kind of culminated, not just now, not just in recent years, but over the last 10 years also, in everyone saying that, hey, that's just a recall question. Or, hey, let's do some application-based questions. And in our experience, we've seen that, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and there's very difficult to kind of tease apart what a recall question is and what an application question is. So let's start by talking about just what we think recall questions are.
I think at the foundation of it, every question requires recall. There's no question that can be answered. If you're thinking about an exam setting or an assessment setting, no question can be answered without some amount of recall. So, for example, if we want students to punctuate something correctly in an English language exam, they're still going to have to recall those rules of punctuation, without which they're not going to be able to answer that question. Whether they have to write an essay, which really is not asking them to do any recall, but write an essay, they're still having to recall rules of grammar and rules of punctuation. Recall is at the foundation of every question we ask.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. Like even in the most, high inference kind of questions where you are asking students to interpret from data, you give a table or you give a chart or a graph, and the students are asked to interpret things. Even in that, they have to recall, basic procedural skills of addition, multiplication, subtraction, even sometimes, how to get a percentage. And those are essentially recall. So I get what you're saying that, every question needs some amount of recall. But if I just push you a little bit, every question does require recall to some extent and in different ways. But there are still some questions that are purely recall, right?
Yeah. So if you think about it extremely practically, if we have to create a recall-based question for a test for students, that will mean that we're basically asking them for a fact that they have had to remember. So again, for example, maybe in a history exam, asking students to write the date of a war or a treaty. That is purely recall. It doesn't require any amount of application beyond that.
Right. And I know that there's some, I don't want to call it taboo, but some kind of taboo with recall questions. And when we go to schools, they're like, but these are recall questions. So there is still merit in asking recall questions, right? I meant purely recall questions.
There's definitely merit in asking purely recall questions, because it forms the basis of all other skills that students build. If you're asking students to learn some facts and then testing them on it, that ensures that any application that we want them to do, say if we want them to analyze a particular war in history or the circumstances that led to it, knowing the dates that happened and what happened in other areas, for example, on those dates that led to that war, that is important. So recall questions are definitely important to build that basis of knowledge. And if we think about it purely from a cognitive science lens, recall is basically making the connections in our long-term memory stronger and stronger. So each time we make the effort to recall something that is not very easy to recall, the connections in our long-term memory, or these pathways, if we imagine them as that in our long-term memory, become strong. And what then ends up happening is that the stronger they become, the easier it is for us to recall, to the point of it becoming almost an automatic process. And if we are able to recall things automatically, which is without putting in really any effort, it makes all other skills a lot more easier to learn and apply.
Right. I think I get it. And especially when you go back, I mean, I'm just going to go back to that example of that data interpretation question, where even if I need to apply or infer or, analyze something, if the addition and subtraction is automatic for me, then the question becomes way easier for me than if I have to actually sit down and calculate separately as to, okay, 10 plus 18 is going to be 28, and I have to do this carryover or don't do carryover, etc. So I understand that the what we call as the cognitive load on the student to try and answer something would also go down if there are enough recall questions asked at regular intervals and the automaticity is built in these skills or even recall of knowledge. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sorry, you're going to say something.
No, I was just going to add that I know that there's a lot of question right now around the utility of students learning multiplication tables. But that is a really classic example of recall leading to knowledge becoming automatic. Because we spend so much time almost rote learning those mathematics, those multiplication tables, a lot of maths becomes a lot easier for us because we are able to do those multiplications in our head. Similarly with the alphabet song. Students are able to recall letters of the alphabet so easily because of the number of times that they practice them, and that makes a lot of higher order skills easier. So recall is definitely not bad.
So I still sing the alphabet song to know which letter comes after what in the alphabet. So I'm not going to go into that at all. But yes. So yeah, I understand that. And I'm just going to change gears slightly and kind of move the lens from a question making point of view. You said that, connections that are built need to be reinforced. When I keep recalling something, that connection gets reinforced. So when I'm asking a recall question, would it be good if I give certain amount of context around that question for the students? Because recall doesn't happen in isolation. There are certain connections that have been made to different things in the brain. And if I can give them certain context, that may help them recall better. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, context definitely helps because there may be new terms that we're introducing to kids that may not make may not be easy to remember. But if we connect them to known things, they definitely become easier to remember. So, a very common example that we've discussed very often and also maybe written about is the starch test.
Right. So on one hand, a question can be without any context, how do we test for starch in a sample? Whereas we say that, okay, a samosa contains starch, proteins, lipids, etc. How do we test for starch in a samosa? Now, in both these cases, clearly the testing objective is still the same. We want to know, okay, it's iodine test that we have to use. And that's just, it's a recall thing. It's in the textbooks. They just have to recall from there. But the context of a samosa kind of, might trigger, okay, oh, potatoes. Okay. So, some connections might happen and say, okay, starch, iodine. Because I looked at a potato in my class and iodine was put on the potato. So, these kind of connections can be made if we give context to students. So, I said that the second question that I asked, that a samosa contains lipids, proteins, starch, etc. And how do we test for starch? Is that not an application question then?
I don't think it qualifies as an application question because, like you said, the testing objective is still having students recall that you need to use a particular test to test for the presence of something. It's purely recall. None of the other context really is something that the students need to use to answer that question. So we may add context around a question to help students recall better, but context doesn't necessarily lead to it becoming an application question.
Hi, we have developed an amazing tool to help teachers plan their lessons, TEPS, or Things Education's pedagogical strategies. TEPS helps teachers by reducing the time that they spend on planning lessons. TEPS also helps you if you want to try a different pedagogical approach to teaching. So, if you want to know how to teach a topic in a project-based or inquiry-based or even constructivist learning approach, TEPS is for you. TEPS helps even seasoned teachers with fresh ideas on how to teach specific topics. So, scan the QR code on the screen or visit teps.school and join a community of empowered educators. Great teaching begins with TEPS.
Okay, so I understand that. So if the testing objective is still a recall objective, then all the context around it is mainly to help students with the recall. And if I want to make it an application question, it needs to go a step further. Okay, so then I'm going to try and modify this question that I made on the fly. Let's see how it goes. A samosa contains potatoes, flour, chilies, salt, etc. Would a sample of samosa give me a positive in an iodine test? So here, the student would need to recall that, hey, iodine test is for starch. A samosa contains potato and flour, which are made up of starch. And having recalled these two and made that connection, and then say that, yes, in this test, you would get a positive uh, result for iodine. And this, I'm guessing, this is the application part, where two different information were recalled and were applied to this situation, which was slightly novel for the student. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this, like we can see, it has a foundation of recall, but is pushing students to make connections in their brain that may not that have been explicitly taught to them to be able to be recalled very easily. So this is definitely an application question. Similarly, say in an English paper, if we're asking students for the meanings of similes that have been listed out, that's still a recall question. Or if we give them a passage and we ask them to uh, read it, and then we give them the similes based on that passage and ask them to explain the meaning, that still requires recall if they've learned those similes beforehand. But maybe even reducing the question a little bit and just asking them to identify new similes in a passage is application, because here they then have to remember what a simile is, what its function is, and then identify similes in a passage based on the definition of it.
Right. And I mean, similes is just one example that we're using here. Because as a lot of educators who are experienced will know that students basically just memorize those phrases, for simile. But even for this would work for any figure of speech, if it's a metaphor, if it's a tautology, etc. So yes, I get what you're saying. Absolutely. Basically, I know something. Can I apply this knowledge in a completely different context? And what would be cool is the highest level of this would be, kind of abstraction. Can I take this knowledge, completely make it abstract and put it in a completely different context? Like, for example, if we have the laws of physics, how they operate on Earth, the laws are going to remain the same, even if you go to Mars or the moon. But the entire calculation, the base of calculations of figuring anything out, the amount of friction, the amount of gravitational force, etc., are going to be all different. So the recall knowledge is going to be very useful, but the application is going to be completely almost abstract. So I think if that is, I mean, that's the journey, and I think that's what we're trying to say, that recall is pure recall, and then if you can get to a level where you can abstract it to a completely different context, that's probably the height of application learning or application testing in a sense. So yeah, I think these are good points to keep in mind when you're trying to build questions. What is a recall question? Are we almost fooling ourselves when we just add context around a recall question and still ask a recall question? So we just need to be careful about these things. And for a long time, we have been talking about how to go from recall to application and how adding context is important. Now, these are the positives that we have spoken about. There are also, on the other hand, there are some things that we have to be careful about when we are creating these questions and not maybe, create a lot of context or give too much context in questions. And why is that also important?
So this goes back to what we've talked about very often about cognitive load. If you're giving context that is either it could be too much, where students have to read an entire passage to finally just say that I will use an iodine test to test for starch. So if we go back to the example of the starch test with the samosa, and we're giving students a longish passage to read about, say, a conversation between two friends and eating samosas and testing for starch using iodine. While that context may be right and it may give them all the right information, it may actually be too much because one, students may be trying to focus on details that may not be finally important to the testing objective that you're focusing on, which is overloading their working memory. They're maybe making connections to characters that they've read about, or they're trying to really identify what you're asking. It may be too much cognitive load for them, which finally ends up showing up as an incorrect answer. Or even more tangibly, they may end up wasting a lot of time in their time exam or the half an hour that they have for that test in reading a passage that is really not helping them recall or manage their working memory, which then ends up showing up as missed questions or whatever else it is. So as long as the context is concise and it's very, very relevant to helping them make connections, that's great. But longish context, which is going to overload them or lead them to waste time, may not be the most useful.
Right. I think that makes sense that, okay, give context, but don't give so much context that is going to confuse them, get them to focus on the wrong things, or even sometimes, give contradictory information. And you might not think it is contradictory, but, a very small word somewhere may get them to feel that, okay, wait a minute, I don't know what is being asked yet. So I think we have to be careful about these questions, and we'll keep talking about these questions and thinking about them and then sharing them with you. We do the thinking so that you don't have to. You can go ahead and go do that good teaching. So yeah, I think we can pause here, stop here. So thanks a lot, Ritu, for this, and thank you everyone for joining in. And yes, like we said, this is a 6 month anniversary almost of this podcast, and we've also done 25 other videos on our other uh, video series called TE Pedagogy Power Ups. So go check that out. Please keep supporting us here. If you like this video, hit a like, subscribe, tell everyone about it. Thanks a lot, and see you again soon.